Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke recently said he would revoke the tax exemptions of churches that oppose same sex marriage. He later said he was misinterpreted, even though that is totally what he said, and that he was really talking about punishing religious business owners who discriminated against gay customers, which, yeah, they should be punished. But the reaction from a lot of atheists when he said the first thing was good. He should go even further because churches should not be tax exempt in the first place. That is the wrong response. Look, there is a problem with churches and tax exemptions, but the fact that churches are tax exempt isn't it. So hear me out, because anyone making this argument should know how these tax exemptions work and why revoking them from churches would be a bad idea. It takes a little while to explain, but I promise we'll get there. In theory, all nonprofit groups provide some kind of value to some people. A university provides education. A charity might work to find a cure for something. A decent church gives people comfort. Even groups like Planned Parenthood and the National Rifle Association are providing services that their members appreciate. In order to remain a nonprofit, there are just a few major rules you have to follow. Stick to your mission. Don't endorse political candidates. Tell us who your biggest donors are, things like that. Now, is it possible that the people running these groups get paid way too much money, or that there's corruption within the organization, or that, they really act more like a business than a nonprofit? Yeah, of course. And we should always criticize that when it's happening. That's happening right now with the NRA. But in order to know that's happening, we need to know how they use their money, whether it's through transparency or a whistleblower. The way the government tries to keep them honest is by having registered nonprofits fill out what's called a Form 990. It's basically an annual write-up for the IRS saying, here's how much money we made and here's how we're using it. In some cases, for larger groups, they have to disclose how much money the top leaders make. It's also a public form. There are websites like GuideStar and Charity Navigator that compile these documents and make them accessible to the public. But here's the big problem with those 990s. Churches and other religious groups don't have to fill them out. They get all the benefits of being a nonprofit with none of the accountability. There are a lot of megachurches where the main pastor's salary is unknown even to the congregation. The churches take in all the money, they pay no taxes on it, and the public never gets to know how they're using it. We just have to trust them. And they have not earned that trust. One study even found that religious groups took in a third of all donations to nonprofits. That's a lot of money going into a black hole. So you might ask, why are religious groups the exception to the rule? There's honestly no good reason. In the 1940s, a lot of businesses complained that nonprofits were hurting their bottom line. Not churches, but other groups. So when the government first said nonprofits have to fill out these 990 forms, they said churches didn't have to. They were not the problem. And even though tax laws changed over the years, the church exception never went away. It's this vestigial law we just can't get rid of. Truth be told, the church exception is arguably a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, but because it's there now, there's virtually no chance politicians would ever risk trying to take it away. Holding churches to the same standards as other groups, treating them fairly when they've had privilege for so long, would be perceived as anti-Christian. Because when you've gotten away with everything for so long, being held accountable feels unfair. Politicians could force churches to fill out that paperwork if they had some courage. I mean, in 1987, the IRS even said if we made churches fill out those forms, there would be no legal problem with it. Of course there wouldn't be. You'd just be treating them the same as every other nonprofit. But because churches have gotten away with this for so long, they've started to push the boundaries even more, daring the IRS to take away their nonprofit status by endorsing candidates. It's like the one thing they're not allowed to do. It's all part of an attempt to make it look like Christians are being persecuted even though they're the ones violating the rules. There have been times when pastors tell their congregations who to vote for, send a video of that sermon to the IRS, and then nothing happens. They broke the rules and the IRS does nothing. I mean, part of the problem is that the IRS is understaffed, and going after churches is just a low priority. Part of the problem is that they just don't want to deal with the Fox News backlash that would ensue if they ever revoked a tax exemption from a church, even for legitimate reasons. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's go back to the original question. Should churches be tax exempt? The answer is yes. They are a nonprofit. They do provide a service. I mean, most churches are not in it for the money. The pastors are not getting rich. I don't like what all nonprofits do. I'm not a fan of the NRA or all those anti-abortion groups, but that doesn't matter. The government just says if you want to be a nonprofit, follow a couple of big rules and you get the tax exemption. Your specific beliefs are irrelevant. So what if they're anti-gay? I mean, I don't want the government taking away any group's tax exempt status based on their beliefs. Imagine how that could be abused depending on who's in power. I don't want a Republican administration saying Planned Parenthood doesn't get to be tax exempt because they're murdering babies. And I don't want a Democrat saying a church can't be tax exempt because they don't support marriage equality. That belief is despicable, but punishing thought is a horrible idea when the government does it. What about all churches then? I mean, even the progressive ones that are not anti-gay. Should we take away all their tax exemptions? That is also a bad idea because you're singling out a specific kind of group and saying they shouldn't get the same perk everyone else has access to. That's a slippery slope we do not want to go down. I don't want to punish a bunch of wonderful Unitarian churches just because, Scientology screws things up for everyone. Legally speaking, too, you really can't revoke the tax exemptions of churches without revoking the tax exemptions of charities altogether. It would never fly in court. The problem is not that churches are tax exempt. The problem is that churches aren't playing by the same rules. What I want is for all tax exempt groups to be held to the same standards. Churches should have to fill out those 990s. If they don't, or if a pastor endorses a political candidate from the pulpit, or if there's clear evidence of corruption, then sure, revoke it. That applies to every group that breaks the rules. But that has nothing to do with the beliefs of those groups, only their actions. I don't want churches getting special treatment from the government, which is what's happening right now. And I don't want certain nonprofits getting a raw deal from the government based on their beliefs, which is what people are suggesting when they say churches don't deserve the exemption because of their views. I will say this as an atheist. Many churches do good work. They're wrong about God, but they help people who believe. They work food kitchens, they volunteer, they give people hope. They do what they say they're here to do. If they lost their nonprofit status, you know who would suffer? A hell of a lot of poor people, a lot of drug addicts, a lot of people who depend on religious ministries for social services. It's very narrow-minded to think we'd only be hurting some wealthy preacher who flies around on a private jet. I wish more churches would demand to be treated fairly by the IRS too. Honestly, if churches had to be open and honest about how they spend their money, the ones that do it properly would be doing even better. I mean, imagine being the pastor who could say, I have proof that I don't get paid some ridiculous salary, and we use our donations to help the poor, and we pay an outside group to audit our finances so there are no shenanigans. I'm not a televangelist who's scamming you out of money with faith healing and giant buckets of food. More power to church leaders who could say that. But because the IRS doesn't force them to play fair, churches that are open and honest like that are few and far between. So Beto O'Rourke was wrong when he suggested churches should be punished for their beliefs. The government should never be in the business of punishing thought. Churches can do whatever they want to do within their bubble. If they want to ban people from getting married within the church walls, that's their business. If they want to say, we don't perform interracial weddings in our building, that's insane, but also they should be allowed to do that. I hope members walk out in protest, but that's a different issue. Someone like that Kentucky clerk, Kim Davis, should not be allowed to get away with refusing to sign a same-sex marriage license just because she's a Christian who works for the government. But a pastor who is just a pastor and doesn't want to perform a same-sex ceremony, he should be allowed to do that. So when it comes to tax exemptions, churches should be allowed to keep them. I'm fine with that. But in return, they should have to play by the same rules as every other tax-exempt organization. It is that simple.